was a 3-year-old boy in the house the morning his mother was beaten to death, and he told the grown-ups exactly what happened. He said a monster did it. He said the monster had a big mustache and that his daddy wasn't home. The men investigating the murder wrote it down, and then they buried it, along with a bloody bandana and a green van, and every other thing that pointed away from the man they had already decided was guilty. That man was the boy's father. He would spend the next 25 years in a Texas prison for a murder he did not commit, while the real monster walked free and killed again. His name is Michael Morton. In 1986, he was a 32-year-old grocery store manager outside Austin, Texas, with a wife he loved, a little boy, and an ordinary, quiet life. By the end of that year, he had lost all three and been branded the man who destroyed them. What happened to Michael Morton is not just the story of an innocent man sent to prison. It's the story of what it takes to get him out, and of the two men behind his nightmare. One of them held the murder weapon. The other one held a badge and a law degree and did something that, in the end, would be called a crime. Keep both of them in mind, because this story does not give you one villain. It gives you two, and it makes you wait for both. Start with the morning, because everything turns on the morning. August 13th, 1986. The day before had been Michael Morton's 32nd birthday. The family had gone out to dinner to celebrate. Michael, his wife Christine, and their 3-year-old son Eric. They came home, they put their little boy to bed, and the night ended the way ordinary nights end. Then before dawn, Michael got up, got dressed, and left for work. He managed a supermarket, and he was due in early. He was out the door around 6 in the morning, before the sun, while his wife and son were still asleep in the house. That detail, the time he left, is going to matter enormously. Hold on to it. When Michael came home from work that afternoon, he found his neighborhood full of police cars. Christine Morton had been beaten to death in her own bed. The person who found her first was not Michael. It was a neighbor alerted because 3-year-old Eric had been left alone in the house with his mother's body. The scene was brutal in a way that is hard to talk about with any decency, so I'm going to be careful here. Christine was killed with a wooden club in the bedroom, and whoever did it had taken time. They had piled objects on top of her body before they left. This was not a robbery interrupted in 10 frantic seconds. Somebody had been in that house with a small child down the hall and had done something monstrous and had lingered. And there was a witness. There was, in fact, the best kind of witness and the worst kind of witness at the very same time, a child who saw it happen. Little Eric was 3 years old. In the days after the murder, he talked. Children that age don't lie the way adults do. They also don't understand what they're describing. And what Eric described to his grandmother, Christine's mother, Rita, was this. He said a monster had come into the house. He said the monster had hurt his mommy, had hit her with something. He said the monster had a big mustache. And crucially, he said his daddy was not there. Daddy wasn't home. His grandmother, shaken, passed all of this to the sheriff's office, and one of the lead investigators, a sergeant named Don Wood, wrote it into the record. A witness to the murder had named the killer as a stranger, a monster who was not Michael Morton, and had placed Michael out of the house when it happened. You would think that would be the center of the investigation. It was not. It was the first thing they threw away. Because by the time little Eric was talking, the men in charge had already made up their minds. And once you understand how they made up their minds, you understand everything that went wrong here, because they didn't reason their way to Michael Morton. They started with him. In a case like this, with a wife dead in the bedroom, the investigators reach for the oldest assumption in the book, the one that is right often enough to be dangerous. The husband did it. It's almost always the husband. So they didn't ask, who killed Christine Morton? They asked, well, how do we prove Michael did? And those are not the same question. They are opposite questions, and the difference between them is a man's entire life. So watch what they do with the evidence once the answer's already written. Remember the time Michael left for work, around 6 in the morning. If the murder happened after 6, Michael was gone. He was at the store, in front of witnesses, punching a clock. So the investigators needed the murder to have happened before 6, while Michael was still in the house. How do you prove a time of death that precise? You can't really, not reliably. But there was a medical examiner willing to estimate the time of Christine's death by analyzing the contents of her stomach, how far her last meal had digested. Based on that, the state would argue Christine died in the small hours before Michael left. Stomach contents timing is the kind of science that sounds authoritative in a courtroom and falls apart the moment a real expert looks at it. It has since been thoroughly discredited as a way to pin down a time of death. But in 1986, it was good enough to do the job it was hired to do, to erase Michael Morton's alibi and put him back inside the house at the moment of the murder. And there was a motive, or at least there was a story that could be sold as one. The prosecution's theory was that Michael had flown into a murderous rage because on the night of his birthday, his wife had gone to sleep and declined to have sex with him. That was it. That was the engine they proposed for a husband bludgeoning the mother of his child to death in her bed, a bruised ego on his birthday. It is a thin, ugly little theory, and it asks you to believe that a man with no history of this kind of violence became a killer over a single rejection. But paired with a manufactured time of death, it was a story a jury could be walked through. Means, motive, opportunity, all of it reverse-engineered from the conclusion. On September 25, 1986, a little over a month after his wife was murdered, Michael Morton was arrested and charged with killing her. Now sit inside that for a second, because the cruelty of it is easy to skate past. This is a man who has just lost his wife. His little boy has lost his mother. And instead of grief, instead of being allowed to bury Christine and try to hold what was left of his family together, Michael is pulled out of that family and accused of being the one who destroyed it. His son is taken from him. The people around him begin to look at him as a killer. He has gone in a matter of weeks from a widower to a monster in the eyes of his own town. And the one witness who could have told them they had the wrong man, the little boy who actually saw it, had already told them and been ignored. That was the case walking into the courtroom, an assumption dressed up as an investigation. Now let's watch what the state did with it. Because the trial is where the husband did it, hardened into a life sentence, and where the evidence that could have stopped it got locked in a drawer. The man who prosecuted Michael Morton was the Williamson County District Attorney, and his name was Ken Anderson. Remember that name because he is the second villain of the story, and unlike most villains in cases like this, he does not get to slip away at the end. But in 1987, Ken Anderson was simply the most powerful lawyer in the county, a rising star with a reputation as a tough, winning prosecutor. The kind of prosecutor who did not lose. And he built the case against Michael Morton the way you build a case when the physical evidence isn't there, on story and on emotion and on the things the jury never got to see. Because here is the astonishing thing about the case against Michael Morton. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murder. None. No blood on him, no weapon in his hand, no fingerprint, no witness who saw him do it. Nothing that a fair look at the scene would have connected to Michael. What the state had was a discredited stomach contents time of death, a shabby theory about birthday night rejection, and a jury's instinct that when a wife is dead, you look at the husband. On that foundation, and only that, they asked 12 people to bury a man alive. And they nearly had to do it honestly because there was a mountain of evidence pointing the other way. The problem, Michael's problem, the tragedy at the exact center of this whole case is that the jury never saw the mountain. Ken Anderson made sure of it. Let me lay out what was kept from that jury, because each piece on its own would have raised a reasonable doubt, and together they were an entirely different story about who killed Christine Morton. First, the boy. The record contains Sergeant Wood's account of what 3-year-old Eric had said, that a monster, a man who was not his father, had killed his mother, and that his father was not home when it happened. An eyewitness to the crime, the only eyewitness, had described a stranger and cleared Michael. The defense was never told. Second, the green van. Neighbors had reported seeing a man they didn't recognize, parking a green van behind the Mortons' house in the days around the murder, and getting out and walking into the wooded area behind the property. A stranger casing the back of the house, right where the killer would have come and gone. The defense was never told. Third, the bandana. Not far from the house, reporting puts it around 100 yards away, about a block near a construction site, A bloody bandana had been found and turned over to investigators. It was exactly the kind of thing a killer might use and discard while fleeing. Nobody tested it. Nobody told the defense it existed. It went into evidence and it sat there. Remember the bandana? In 25 years, it is going to walk back into this story and blow it wide open. Fourth, the stolen property. Christine's purse was missing. After her death, her credit card and her checkbook were used. A card connected to a jewelry store transaction in San Antonio. A woman reportedly trying to cash one of Christine's checks. Robbery. A stranger taking her things and spending them. That is not what a husband who kills his wife in a birthday rage does. That is what a burglar who kills a woman in her home does. The defense was never told. There were unidentified fingerprints. There were footprints that weren't accounted for. Piece by piece, the sheriff's own file was full of a second story. The true story of an intruder who came in from the woods, robbed and murdered Christine Morton while her husband was at work and was seen and was described by a 3-year-old and by the neighbors and by the physical evidence he left behind. And piece by piece, that file was kept in the dark. This is the thing people find hardest to believe, so let me be precise about it, because it is established of record and it is the reason this case became a landmark. It later came out that Anderson had been told about this evidence and had moved to keep it from the defense. The record includes his instruction regarding Sergeant Wood's reports, the ones with the boy's account in them, that the other side can't have access to those reports. The other side, as if the truth about who murdered a woman were a competitive advantage to be hoarded, rather than the entire point of a murder trial. A prosecutor's job on paper is not to win. It's to see justice done, and that includes handing over evidence that helps the accused. The law requires it. Anderson didn't just fail to hand it over. He is on record making sure the other side couldn't have it. So the jury that decided Michael Morton's fate was shown half a case, the ugly, incriminating hollow half, and blinded to the half that would have set him free. They saw a grieving widower's story reframed as a killer's performance. They heard about a birthday and a rejection. They heard a time of death that put him in the house. They did not hear about the monster, the mustache, the green van, the bandana, or the stolen checks. How do you reach a fair verdict when someone has reached into the evidence and pulled out everything that might change your mind? You don't. On February 17, 1987, the jury convicted Michael Morton of murdering his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison. And here is the moment I want you to really see, because it's the human core of what a wrongful conviction actually does. Michael Morton stood in that courtroom, having already lost Christine, and was now told he would lose everything else: his freedom, his future, and his son. He had done nothing. He knew he had done nothing. And he had to stand there and listen to the people of his own community declare, formally on the record, that he was the man who beat the mother of his child to death. He would later describe the surreal horror of it, of screaming the truth on the inside while the world calmly, confidently agreed on a lie. His little boy, Eric, was adopted by relatives and raised to believe his father was a murderer. The one person on earth who had actually named the killer grew up thinking that killer was his dad. The doors closed. Michael Morton went to prison to serve a life sentence for a crime committed by a stranger in a green van. And as far as the state of Texas was concerned, the case of Christine Morton's murder was closed, solved, and over. It would take a quarter of a century, a pro bono lawyer who wouldn't quit, and one small piece of blue cloth to prove that everyone in that courtroom had been wrong. 25 years. It is almost impossible to make that number mean anything, so let me try. When Michael Morton walked into prison, Ronald Reagan was president. There were no smartphones, no internet in anyone's home. His son Eric was a toddler. By the time the fight to free him reached its climax, that toddler was a grown man with children of his own, who had spent his entire conscious life believing his father was a murderer. Michael missed all of it. Every birthday, every school year, every ordinary Tuesday of his son's childhood, from inside a cell for a crime he did not commit, while the man who actually killed Christine was somewhere out in the world, living his life. And for most of those years, there was no cavalry coming. This is the part of these stories that gets skipped in the highlight reel. An exoneration looks from the outside like a single dramatic moment. The doors open, the man walks free. But that moment sits on top of years and years of grinding, unglamorous, mostly losing legal work, done while the prisoner ages and hope gets harder to hold. Imagine knowing with total certainty that you are innocent and being surrounded every single day by people who are equally certain that you are a monster. Imagine grieving a wife you loved while wearing the label of the man who killed her. That was Michael Morton's life, not for a week or a year, but for a quarter of a century with no guarantee it would ever end. Most men break under far less. Michael maintained his innocence the entire time. He filed. He was denied. He filed again. Years passed. Nothing moved. The system, having convicted him, had almost no interest in reconsidering. A closed case is a comfortable thing, and reopening one means admitting you might have destroyed a man for nothing. What changed Michael Morton's life was DNA, and a lawyer who refused to let go. His name was John Raley, a Houston attorney who took Michael's case pro bono, for free, and who would spend years on it. He was joined by the Innocence Project, the organization built specifically to use DNA testing to overturn wrongful convictions, and by one of its attorneys, Nina Morrison. And beginning in 2005, they focused on a simple, powerful idea. The technology to read DNA from old evidence now existed, technology that hadn't existed at the original trial. There was biological evidence in the Morton case that had never been tested. If they could test it, science could finally answer the question in the 1987 jury was never allowed to ask. Whose DNA is actually on the evidence from this murder? And there was that bandana. The bloody bandana found near the house that had sat in an evidence locker, untested for the better part of 2 decades. Michael's lawyers wanted it tested. If it carried Christine's blood, and it did, and it also carried the DNA of some other man, a man who was not Michael Morton, then the entire case collapsed. That bandana could name the real killer. You would think the state would want to know. You would think that if there were any chance an innocent man was rotting in prison, the people sworn to do justice would be first in line to run the test. Instead, Michael Morton's lawyers hit a wall, and the wall had a name. The Williamson County District Attorney by this point was a man named John Bradley, the successor in that same office to Ken Anderson. And Bradley fought the DNA testing. He fought it hard, and he fought it for years, roughly 6 of them. He argued against it, he raised objections, he ran out the clock. For 6 years, a prosecutor's office stood between Michael Morton and a scientific test that could prove his innocence. A test that would cost the state almost nothing and could cost Michael nothing but more wasted life. Every month that fight dragged on was another month an innocent man spent in a cell, and another month the real killer spent free. Think about the arrogance it takes to fight that. To look at a request to simply test a piece of evidence, not to release anyone, just to test it, and to say no again and again for 6 years. It's the behavior of a system far more invested in protecting its old verdict than in finding the truth. If Michael Morton was guilty, the test would confirm it, and the fight would be pointless. The only world in which you fight this hard to prevent a test is a world where, somewhere underneath, you are afraid of what the test will say. But John Raley and the Innocence Project would not quit, and the years of grinding finally paid off. In June of 2011, after roughly 6 years of resistance, a judge ordered the bandana tested. The evidence that Ken Anderson had hidden in 1987 and that John Bradley had fought to keep buried through the 2000s was finally going to a laboratory to be read by the one witness that cannot be intimidated, bought, or ignored, the DNA itself. Michael Morton had been in prison for close to 25 years. And everything, his freedom, his name, the truth about who killed Christine, and the discovery of a horror no one yet suspected, all of it now came down to what that lab found on a strip of blue cloth. The lab found 2 people on the bandana. One was Christine Morton, her blood, her hair, placing that cloth at her murder exactly as Michael's lawyers had believed. And the other was a man. A man's DNA mixed with the blood of the murdered woman on the object dropped near her home while she was being killed. A man who was not Michael Morton. For the first time in a quarter of a century, there was hard, physical, unarguable proof of what a 3-year-old boy had tried to tell everyone in 1986 someone else was in that house. The monster was real. On October 4th, 2011, Michael Morton walked out of prison. And on December 19th, 2011, a court made it official and formal in a way that so few of these cases ever get. He was not merely released on a technicality, he was declared innocent. Exonerated. The conviction erased. He became the 45th man in Texas alone to be freed by modern DNA testing, a number that should stop you cold because it means Michael Morton's nightmare was not a freak accident. It was one of dozens. He walked out a 57-year-old man who had gone in at 32, and among the first things he did was begin to rebuild a relationship with his son Eric, the boy who had witnessed the murder, who had been raised to believe his father did it, and who now had to absorb that the man he'd been taught to hate had been innocent all along and had lost 25 years to that lie. That would be enough. That would already be one of the worst wrongful conviction stories you'll ever hear. But the DNA didn't just clear Michael Morton. It had a name attached to it. And the name is where this story turns from tragedy into something closer to horror. The DNA on the bandana was run through the database, and it matched a man named Mark Allen Norwood. Norwood was a drifter, a dishwasher, a convicted felon with a record, a man who had been living in the Austin area back in the mid-1980s. He was exactly the stranger the evidence had always described. In 2013, Mark Norwood was tried for the murder of Christine Morton, and on March 27, 2010, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The real killer, finally named, finally caught, 27 years after he beat a woman to death and let another man take the punishment for it. But here is the part I have to tell you carefully, because it is the cruelest fact in the entire case. When investigators looked at Mark Norwood's DNA, they didn't only connect him to Christine Morton, they connected him to a second murder. In January of 1988, a year and a half after Christine Morton was killed, a woman named Deborah Masters Baker was beaten to death in her home in Austin, killed in a strikingly similar way. For years, her murder had gone unsolved, her family left without answers. And when the DNA came back, it tied Deborah Baker's murder to the same man, Mark Norwood. He was convicted of killing her in September of 2016. Now put the dates together and feel the full weight of it. Christine Morton was murdered in August 1986. Michael was convicted and imprisoned in early 1987. Deborah Baker was murdered in January 1988, which means that when Norwood killed Deborah Baker, Michael Morton was already sitting in a prison cell, locked up for the murder Norwood himself had committed. Do you see what that means? If the police had listened to the little boy in 1986, if they had chased the green van, tested the bandana, followed the stolen credit cards instead of hiding all of it, they would have been hunting Mark Norwood in 1986. Deborah Baker might be alive. Her murder in 1988 is not just a second tragedy sitting next to the first. It is a consequence of the first. Ken Anderson's decision to bury the evidence and convict the wrong man didn't only cost Michael Morton 25 years. It very likely cost Deborah Baker her life because it let the real killer stay free long enough to kill again. Two families destroyed so that one prosecutor could win one case. Which brings us at last to the second villain, and to the rarest ending in all of American criminal justice. Because normally this is where the story stops. Normally the prosecutor who did this faces nothing. It is astonishingly hard to hold a prosecutor personally accountable for hiding evidence. They are protected by immunity, by professional courtesy, by a system that closes ranks. In the overwhelming majority of these cases, the wrongly convicted man walks free, and the man who framed him keeps his career, his pension, and his good name. Michael Morton's case is one of the vanishingly few exceptions in the entire history of the country. And that is why it matters far beyond Texas. By the time the truth came out, Ken Anderson was no longer just a district attorney. He had been rewarded for his career of winning convictions with a judgeship. He was a sitting state district judge, Your Honor, a man who spent his days ruling over other people's justice. And so the state of Texas did something almost unheard of. It convened a court of inquiry, a rare proceeding, to examine what Ken Anderson had done in the Morton case. Not the conviction, Anderson himself. Whether the prosecutor had committed crimes, In February 2013, that court examined the evidence. And on April 19, 2013, the presiding judge ordered Ken Anderson's arrest. In doing so, the court wrote a sentence that deserves to be read aloud because it names the thing exactly. This court cannot think of a more intentionally harmful act than a prosecutor's conscious choice to hide mitigating evidence so as to create an uneven playing field. A conscious choice, not a mistake, not an oversight, a choice to hide the evidence, to tilt the field and send a man he had reason to know might be innocent to prison for the rest of his life. Ken Anderson resigned his judgeship in September 2013. In November 2013, he was found in criminal contempt of court. He pleaded no contest as part of a plea bargain, and here is what happened to the man who took 25 years from Michael Morton. He was sentenced to 10 days in jail, and with good behavior credit, he served about 5 days. He paid a $500 fine, was ordered to do 500 hours of community service, and he gave up his license. He surrendered his right to practice law, the disgrace of a disbarment for a man who had spent his life as an officer of the court. Let me be honest with you about that sentence, because the show doesn't work if I pretend it's justice. Michael Morton served 25 years. Ken Anderson served 5 days. That is not balance. Nobody could call it balance. But understand what it represented. For the first time that almost anyone could remember, a prosecutor who hid evidence and destroyed an innocent man did not get to walk away clean. He was arrested. He was branded, on the record, a man who made a conscious choice to do intentional harm. He lost the profession he had used as a weapon. In a system almost perfectly designed to never punish its own, Michael Morton's case forced it to punish one of them. And that crack in the wall is part of why this story is told at all. And Michael Morton did one more thing with his stolen 25 years. He refused to let them mean nothing. He walked out of prison, and instead of vanishing into private bitterness, he went to the Texas legislature and told his story. The boy who was ignored, the bandana that was hidden, the 25 years, the second woman who died because the truth was buried. And Texas listened. In 2013, the state passed a law named after him, the Michael Morton Act, signed by Governor Rick Perry in May of that year. It rewrote the rules of criminal discovery in Texas. It forces prosecutors to open their files to the defense, to turn over their evidence, so that what Ken Anderson did to Michael Morton would be far harder for the next Ken Anderson to do to the next Michael Morton. His name, which the state of Texas spent 25 years attaching to a murder, is now attached instead to the law that protects the innocent. So let's go back to the beginning. Back to the 3-year-old boy standing in the wreckage of his family, telling the grown-ups the truth in the only words he had. A monster did it. A monster with a big mustache. And Daddy wasn't home. Every single thing that little boy said was true. There was a monster. His name was Mark Norwood, and he would kill again. Daddy wasn't home. Michael was on his way to work exactly as he'd said, from the first minute to the last. The child solved the case in 1986. The evidence to prove him right was in the sheriff's own files in 1986. Everything the system needed, it already had on day one. It just decided it already knew the answer, and it buried everything that said otherwise. And it took a quarter of a century, a pro bono lawyer, an innocence project, and a strip of blue cloth to dig it all back up. Michael Morton is a free man today. He remarried, he reconnected with his son, and he became one of the most powerful voices for reform in the country. He got a rare thing, not just his freedom, but the truth, formally on the record, and even a measure of accountability from the man who took his life apart. But he got all of it 25 years late, and Deborah Baker did not get it at all. That is the true cost of deciding you already know who's guilty and reaching for whatever proves it. Not one ruined life, but a chain of them. The most haunting fact in this whole story isn't the hidden bandana or the 5-day sentence, or even the second murder. It's that the truth was never actually missing. It was there the entire time, in a child's voice in a police file, waiting to be believed. They just didn't want to hear it, because they'd already decided the husband did it. If you think a 3-year-old who saw the truth should have been listened to the first time, hit like, so the next case gets read by someone willing to hear it.